Uncle Doug.
Hello.
I want to get into Mormon numerology.
It probably exists, does it not?
Well, yes, I've actually heard of some stuff, but Mormons talk a lot about the Mormons use numbers sometimes in ways that nobody else uses numbers. For instance, the number 70 can be a reference to a person and not their age, just they are a 70.
And not even necessarily a group of 70 people.
Yeah, a 70 may not belong to a group of 70 people, right? Exactly.
Right. A 70 could be a group, is a member of a much larger group than 70 people, but they are a member of the quorum of the 70, and then there's a quorum of the 12, and then there's the blah, blah, blah.
And little known fact that the Mormon unit of measure is a scoop of ice cream.
It's either that or it's Jell-O mold.
Yeah. Yeah, so, well, I have just such a Mormon number for us today, fellas, and
hooray!
It'll take a little bit of a preamble to get into it, but it is pretty fascinating. It's one of those things. You know, the three of us grew up Mormon, and then we've done a lot of work in the post-Mormon world, and you're like, well, we probably know everything. Nope.
Oh my God, I love that I don't know everything.
I'm about to demonstrate.
I'm very excited to learn a new thing,
and that everything old is new again. So here we go. So it's been a bumpy couple of weeks here in America, and I fear it ain't over just yet, nor will it be for a while. Sadly, as our deeply conservative and deeply religious countrymen who are either deeply Christian or unblinking zombie followers of a new online Christian offshoot called QAnon. And the very real Christian offshoot, the cult of Trump, have attempted and will likely continue to overthrow our democracy because they didn't win at the ballot box. We're in real trouble here in River City, guys. So I was already thinking about today's subject for a couple of weeks prior to the domestic terror attack on the U.S. Capitol and anything else that very likely has happened in the 48 hours between my recording this and your hearing it. And it is sort of an unhappy coincidence that my topic dovetails so perfectly with the seismic events of these past few days here in these United States. So on January 15th, Greg Sargent of the Washington Post published a dreadfully depressing piece called Trump's GOP has an ugly authoritarian core. I shall quote some of the stats within it. By 66% to 30%, overall Americans say Trump acted irresponsibly in his statements and actions since the election. But Republicans say Trump acted responsibly by 66 to 29%.
Jesus.
By 62 to 31%, Americans say there's no solid evidence of the claims of voter fraud that Trump cited to refuse to accept Joe Biden's victory.
But they only say that because it's true.
But Republicans say there is solid evidence of fraud by 65 to 25%.
They just can't point to it.
Yeah, just 64 losses in court now have.
But that's how deep the conspiracy goes.
Yeah.
Right.
57% of Americans say that Trump bears a great deal or good amount of responsibility for the assault on the Capitol. But 56% of Republicans say Trump bears no responsibility at all.
Oh my! What was that number?
56%.
Oh my God!
But it gets better. And another 22% says he bears just some, totaling 78% of Republicans who largely exonerate him.
Wow.
Right.
52% of Americans say Republican leaders went too far in supporting Trump's effort to overturn the election, but 51% of Republicans say GOP leaders didn't go far enough, while 27% say they got it right. A total of 78% were fully on board or wanted more. Only 16% say they went too far. So this concludes, bubbling underneath all this is the fact that there is really a serious anti-democratic movement afoot among the class of intellectuals who are trying to carve out a purportedly respectable version of Trumpist post-liberalism. As Laura Field and Damon Linker demonstrate, this movement is getting darker, more desperate, and more radical, and some strains of it appear to be contemplating a fundamental and permanent break with liberal democracy's most basic core commitments.
Well, I assume when you say getting darker, you do not refer to skin color.
Oh, absolutely. How deep all this runs among the GOP electorate and what it will mean for the future of GOP politics is hard to say, but it's hard to look at the above polling and feel optimistic. So that's fucking great.
Yeah.
So that gets us to today's subject. As Mark Twain wisely said, history doesn't often repeat itself, but it often rhymes.
Yeah.
And what passed as prelude thing rhymes with our current crisis of conservative religious Americans ready to be done with democracy? Why, the Mormon Council of 50. That's what. Yeah. So
okay.
Yeah.
That big event. I remember that from my reading.
Well, you'll never forget it after this. So, also known as the Living Constitution and the Kingdom of God and His laws and the keys and power thereof and judgment in the hands of His servants, because Joseph Smith was really good at naming things.
I tell you what, there is not an organization in history in more need of an editor than the Mormon Church.
Oh, yeah, Mormonism, absolutely. So from 1844 to possibly 1945, a theocratic or, quote, theodemocratic, I'll get to that word in a tick, secret Mormon shadow government was ready to step in and rule the United States as soon after and soon after the entire world. How about that, fellas? So, a little background. So, for any non-Mormons, this is for you. Joseph Smith was a poor kid from Mud Holler, New York, who didn't want to spend his life behind the plow. He had quite the imagination and was a storyteller, mixing up fragments of other stories like a magpie and adding his own twists and turns to entertain his family because they couldn't afford cable. He also told people he could find gold treasure underground by divining and scrying with a magic rock, and got in a spot of trouble more than once when no treasure was found. A little while later, he had the mad luck of finding a big gold book and a sword and some spectacles that don't matter anymore, and a breastplate in the ground by the edge of the family mud farm. Though he never showed them to anyone else's actual eyes, that's a whole nother story, and then used his magic treasure-finding rock to translate the golden book by putting it in his hat and yelling what it said to his dumb friend on the other side of a dirty blanket, who wrote down the most boring book plagiarized from other books in the whole history of boring plagiarism, and boom, Mormonism happened.
I'm so embarrassed.
It's so embarrassing. Yet somehow, this boring-ass book and the weird made-up-on-the-fly religion that started to form around it caught on with all sorts of mud farmers, city dwellers, and even some rich folk. And before you knew it, Joseph Smith was no longer behind the plow, but rather behind a reckless, wobbly con flying by the seat of his pantaloons to keep it all going and keep it growing. He was kind of a spiritual Bernie Madoff. Oh, and very much like Bernie Madoff, he was also scamming people out of all their money.
Right.
And soon enough, their wives and daughters as well. He promised his rapidly growing flock land, so they headed out of the crowded east into wider western spaces where displacing the original owners was just peachy under the law.
Right.
First to Ohio, before being chased out of there for welching on debts. Then a longer trek to Missouri, where the Mormons pissed off the locals to such an extent they chased them out of one county into another, where they pissed off everybody so very much that a fracas called the 1838 Mormon War occurred, causing so much tumult that the governor of the state, Lilburn Boggs, signed Missouri Executive Order Number 44, ordering the Mormons out of the state upon pain of death. Smith ran like a thief in the night, but ended up being jailed and escaping from the ironically named Liberty Jail, and fled to neighboring...
Great name for a jail, really.
Name. Yeah, especially one that you can get out of so easily. And fled to neighboring Illinois, where in short order he and his flock of thousands of saints set up a town called Nauvoo on one of the shittiest patches of mosquito swamp in the lower 48. Have you ever been there, Dan?
I have not.
It's horrible.
I think we should go together. We should all three of us head out there.
We should do a Hosanna shout from Nauvoo. Well, you're just doing that all the time to keep the fucking mosquitoes off of you. Okay, so Smith and the Mormons were super pissed about the loss of 20 or so lives, and even more so about the huge amount of property they stole from indigenous people and then lost in their forced eviction. Smith had appealed to President Martin Van Buren in Congress for aid and protection during the Mormon War with Missouri, but none was forthcoming. So that pissed Joseph off to no end. Now, those familiar with Mormonism or regular listeners to this podcast will know that despite his humble beginnings, Joseph had a rather grandiose opinion of himself. Like,
just
absurdly so.
As all cult leaders do.
Totally. He's a megalomaniac, right? So what would you guess was his next move in trying to get relief for he and his beleaguered flock, you guys? Joseph Smith for president!
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Now, This was long before we would learn via George W. Bush and Donald Trump that literally any idiot son of a rich man could be president. Now, in the wild, fractious, slave-owning hot mess of a stupid country the United States was in 1844, there were 23 million-ish people. There were only three types of people in the U.S. vis-a-vis the Mormons. There were actual Mormons. There were people who had never heard of them, lucky ducks. And then there was the third group of people who had heard of them but fell somewhere on the spectrum of hating to fearing them. There was plenty of untrue, salacious anti-Mormon propaganda out there, but there were also plenty of people with first-hand knowledge of what total shitbags the Mormons had been as they got evicted further and further west with all Smith's frauds, bank defaults, mob intimidation, theft, and violence.
Yeah, because he didn't just run away when the extermination order came. Like the extermination order came in part because he had been exterminating other people. Like he was a bad neighbor.
He was a terrible neighbor, and they intimidated and basically they raided other villages.
Yeah,
they just stole other people's shit all the time. Now you won't hear that at Temple Square, of course, because they were just martyrs for no particular reason. So the first of the three groups I mentioned above, actual Mormons, numbered 20,000 at most at the time. So carry the 5, hold the 3, and they were not unlike now a statistically insignificant portion of the total U.S. population. They were well under 1%, and a pretty despised one at that at the time. So it's either a tiny brain or huge balls or some combination of both that convinced Smith he had a shot at the White House. And to his minor credit, why wouldn't he think that? After all, he had cooked up a laughably preposterous Third Testament of Christ by pulling it out of his dirt farming ass. And now he was an incredibly rich man, worshipped by thousands, positively swimming in a level of sexual avarice unimaginable since the rule of the Khans, and the lieutenant general of an army of 4,000 men that would die without hesitation at his command.
And this is pre-Civil War.
Pre-Civil War.
So an army of 4,000 men was a significant force in that time and place.
It was a terrifying force.
Yeah.
Your head can get swole with that kind of success, I should think. But even so, it's hard to imagine whom, other than whatever percentage of voting-age men there were in 20,000 Mormons, Smith thought his voting base in the broader country was.
Right.
So soon after declaring his candidacy, and by the way, our friend Bryce Blankenagel at the Naked Mormonism podcast has an episode where he reads Joseph Smith's presidential platform. It takes the better part of an hour, and it's a doozy. Wow. Smith set up a super secretive group of 50 men, and men only, naturally, to be
obviously
his government when he inevitably assumed the presidency. How secret was it? He made them swear not even to tell their wives upon the pain of losing their cursed heads. By the way, he had also strongly considered taking the presidency by military force, using his 4,000-man Nauvoo Legion, which sounds funny until you realize that prior to the Civil War, as Doug was saying, the U.S. standing army was pretty teensy.
Right.
The Mormons would have gotten destroyed because the U.S., unlike the Mormons, could also call up hundreds of thousands of men via the draft. But it's kind of amazing to think that Smith still considered it, right?
They could have gotten far. They could have gotten into the Capitol
been messy.
building.
Listen,
they could have stormed the Capitol building with no problem.
I was going to say, I think our vision of a Washington that's impregnable, has been shattered.
Yeah, and the Capitol had burned 30 years prior to that.
Right,
during the War of 1812. So it was could have happened again. So Smith's presidential platform, as you'll hear if you listen to Bryce read it to you, is kind of a hot mess. It hits a lot of the same lizard brain populism that Trump rode into power, then delivered absolutely none of, with some crazy libertarian twists like almost no taxes at all, abolishing half of Congress for some reason, and using the savings to buy and free all of the slaves in the slave states. So, half the congressional salaries, right? It's like a millionth of what that would have required. Emptying the prisons and sending prisoners to religious, read Mormon, re-education camps, etc. Oh, and we're just going to go ahead and annex Canada and Mexico, all of it. But this beautiful dream would be a theocracy, or in his own little neologism, theodemocracy. In theodemocracy, you guys, every man, and yes, only men, but let us do credit Smith for wanting to free and enfranchise black men in this particular plan.
Yeah, that was pretty cool.
That was, credit where it's due. Every man is free to pursue his passions unencumbered from taxation and regulation, and also free to follow his spiritual agency and conscience, so long as that agency and conscience is allegiance to he as God's prophet on earth and the supremacy of Mormonism. And the tax money this man saves, he is then free to tithe to Smith,
right?
With the check made out to Joseph, no middle name Smith himself. Theodemocracy, way more Theo than democracy. So Joseph imagined these 50
There's always a catch, isn't there?
There's always a catch. You're free to be Mormon. So Joseph Smith imagined these 50 wise men would replace the bothersome institutions of our representative government like the House, the Senate, the Cabinet, the Judiciary, and the Vice President. God
don't need those things. Those things are useless.
Yeah, 50 men would run the entire country from a bog in Illinois. God would tell him what the law was, and he would tell them, and they would make it all happen. 51 Mormon guys would rule the United States of Canada, Mex-America, and then in short order, all the nations of the earth. They did try a couple times to draft a new U.S. Constitution they declared perfect, like a phone call with the Ukrainian president. But in the end, Smith was like, you know what? Let's not bother with writing anything down. God will just tell me what the laws are on any given day. A month after it was formed, Smith even went so far as to force a unanimous vote on the council, accepting him as their king, and so they voted.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. A little aside, this is just such a crazy detail. Bryce has this crazy story where one of the Council of the 50 Mormon guys had on paper devised a tiny battery-powered submarine. I didn't even know there were batteries. And Joseph decided to send it to the Russian Tsar in order to help him vanquish the kind of invincible British Navy using the submarine. And then they would be besties, and the Tsar would help Joseph rule the world, and then Joseph would overthrow him as well.
God, who does that remind me of? Like buddy with the Russians.
Good God.
I'm just trying to figure out that it's on the tip of my tongue.
I'm telling you, when I was reading about this, I'm like, holy fuck, it's like happening now. So yeah, that head just kept swelling. But to his credit, there is no evidence he ever tried to buy Greenland, sell Puerto Rico, or instruct his flock to drink bleach.
That we know about.
That we know about. It's lost to history, Dan. Another weird aside, originally there were two or three non-Mormons in the Council of 50 because Joseph started out wanting it to be ecumenical, but they ended up ditching it pretty soon.
Yeah. There's not a lot in it for you if you're not Mormon.
Not a lot. Like the only thing you can possibly get out of it is to be one of the 50. That would be the only upside. So anyway, it was a weird vibe in the secret Council of 50. They would sit in a semicircle, and they would each speak their minds in order from oldest to youngest. Sucked to be the youngest guy.
Yeah, right.
And every decision had to be 100% unanimous because Smith hated the bickering in Congress so much. So how did Joseph Smith's 1844 presidential run against James Polk and Henry Clay work out? Not great. After getting arrested for destroying a printing press that was printing inconvenient truths about him, he got himself killed in June of that year in a shootout with an angry mob, likely made up of a bunch of his very disgruntled ex-followers and angry locals, not even making it to the Iowa straw poll, which, of course, did not exist yet. So after his death, the Council of 50, like a solid 1/4 or 1/3 of our contemporary countrymen, gave up entirely on the United States, democracy, and their secret attempt to turn it into a Mormon version of The Handmaid's Tale. Under their newly appointed king, the imperious Brigham Young, they turned their efforts towards getting the fuck out of the United States for good.
Yeah.
And so here we are in Salt Lake City.
Yeah, they did it. They made it out of the U.S.
As a result of those secret ruminations, our hometown in what used to be Mexico, but because Mormon history is sometimes hilarious as it is terrible, Great Salt Lake City was back in the United States after the war with Mexico within months of the Mormons' arrival here. So like many of Smith's crazy utopian ideas, The council kind of farted out of existence after a while. Its last recorded meeting was in 1884, but people think it allegedly met from time to time well into the 20th century. But it seems it died for real and maybe forever when its one of its oldest surviving members, Heber J. Grant, died in 1945. So the Council of 50 is yet another of the countless proofs of radical political anti-Americanism in the Mormon DNA. And while the council seems to be as dead as Joseph, this odd readying for the temporal kingdom of Mormon Jesus kind of still resonates today.
Oh, yeah.
If you remember in episode 119, Doug talked about the secret $100 billion fund that is just one of Mormonism's hordes of treasure. When a church spokesman finally spoke to this obscene amount of money they had worked so hard to keep secret, he said two really atrocious things. First, that if it was publicly known, it would discourage members, many of whom are poor, from handing over 10% of their gross income as tithing.
Right, because that's not even a drop in the bucket.
Oh, hey, but kudos for telling the truth for once.
Yeah, I mean, it's horribly cynical and dishonest and duplicitous, but it's true. But secondly, he said that they needed this money to deal with whatever emergencies the church faced upon Jesus' imminent return. You know, when cash will be king, I guess. So, yes, Virginia, Mormonism is still positioning itself to act as the only legitimate government in the post-tribulation times. So I barely scratched the surface of the Council of 50. If you want to know more, our friend Bryce has a 3-part, madly deep dive into the subject in episodes 168 through 170 of his amazing show, Naked Mormonism. And like I was saying at the top, it's one of a million things you just never find out about as an active Mormon.
Yeah.
And even though we plow the post-Mormon soil, on the air once a week, I think, had you guys even heard of it before I brought it up?
I don't know that I had. I don't know.
I knew that Joseph had planned to run for president.
Yeah.
But
that was pretty well known. But this council that would basically replace all government in the United States under him, I knew nothing about. Like it's shadow government.
I mean, it's basically just a dictatorship.
Yeah.
And those are his administrators, because they would all have to do anything he said.
Yeah.
So it's not like their government. They're not making decisions, or if they are, they're subject to just be completely
they're
thrown away.
They're not elected representatives working, as they're ideally supposed to do, working on the behalf of their constituents. They're just yes men to implement whatever he says the law is. So theocracy, guys.
You just said constituents. I think you meant corporate sponsors, right?
Yeah, I did mean that. And by corporate sponsors, I meant the IRA, the NRA. Yes, the Irish Republican Army controls at least one house of Congress. That's for sure.
Oh, we are confused here, ladies and gentlemen.
It is one of the greatest PR victories in history that the Mormon Church has managed to basically triangulate itself away from the insurrectionist, anti-democratic theocracy that it was.
Yeah.
Into just, a wholly owned subsidiary of the American government that it is now.
Isn't that bizarre?
Yeah.
So strange.
Truly amazing.
Yeah.
Well,
so there you go.
and that doesn't even mention their forays into actual communism, but that's a story for another time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there you go. The Council of the 50.
All right. Whew. Well, with that, let us move on.
Smith 44.